Yeah, it's live now.
Assalamu alaikum. Greetings. Welcome to the believers and to our viewers. My name is Hannibal Abdul Shakur. I'm joined today with Tanzeen Doha and Abdurrahman Shakur. Today, we are not doing what we had originally scheduled for today because there's some things that are up in the air and we're waiting to see how they're going to turn out before we do the episode on Jalil Muntakim, inshallah. So today we wanted to do a bit of a sort of try to touch on a few different things. So one, we want to encourage people to bring up the questions that we may not have answered from previous episodes, as well as just things you might have learned in the process of us doing this series, as well as just any, random things that you're interested in discussing that specifically relate to this series. And we want to go over those things, inshallah, as well as we have some points of our own with regards to current events and history and some comparisons that we have observed ourselves. And so we hope for this to be somewhat of a bridge between episodes and to kind of tie in anything that we didn't fully address or we didn't go into enough detail on, and as well as, bringing together some of the different episodes that have connections that we didn't explore yet. So inshallah. So inshallah, if we don't have any questions, which I don't see any questions yet, do one of you guys want to start us off with an observation?
Yeah, we're going to talk about like things from the series that we individually also find useful. So maybe certain components of a few of the successors, or all of them, or even from Malcolm X's speech, or all the topics we covered in the series so far. So we wanted to have like a conversation about also their contemporary relevance. Like a lot of things are happening right now, especially since what happened in Minnesota with the protests and the waves of riots and things like that that's happened. And also the Trump administration has been doing things. And then you have, the election year, and there's all these conversations about that. So yeah, I thought we could use this time to sort of go through various points like that relate to the Malcolm X Successor series. So yeah, we could go and choose some of those things. I mean, whoever wants to go first.
Since both of y'all said that, I guess I'll go first.
Yeah, go ahead, exactly.
One of the points that I wanted to touch about on Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim is, so when I was looking over a lot of the different people that we've touched so far in regards to Successors of Malcolm, see a lot of similarities, we see some differences, but I wanted to kind of like tie some, concrete examples of the way in which, outside of just theoretically, but experiences, how some of these people are successors of Malcolm. So, and the way I kind of wanted to do it in regards to talking about it was, I kind of used Amir Abdul Malik's speech or khutbah that he gave on Malcolm X as a spiritual warrior. Mm-hmm. And in this khutbah, he talks about three main things that kind of like focus and like, he focused on three main things in regards to Malcolm being a spiritual warrior. They're Tawheed, and going from Shirk to Tawheed, his practice of Zuhud, and the fact that, he displayed no fear of death. And these three things in particular that, he talks about in this khutbah about being a great spiritual resume. And I feel like some of the people, well, I think all of the people, but in particular, also, I think embody these qualities as well through their work. and their experience. So like in this Khutbah, when y'all get a chance, y'all can just type in YouTube Malcolm X, Spiritual Warrior with Abdel Malik Ali. And he talks about El-Hajj Malik going from Shirk to Tawheed, and how this was important for Malcolm in expanding his international perspective and understanding the importance of connecting the Afro-American struggle, as he would have identified it, with the international struggling peoples of the world, particularly those Muslims. And so this was important for him to do so, because he saw that the benefits of the Black struggle, there's benefits to the Black struggle in internationalizing it, right? In recognizing your allies, particularly through the lens of Islam, but just struggling people in general. I think Malcolm exemplified that clearly. And so we see how Tawheed, believing in the one God, definitely helped his approach. And we can definitely see that with two people in particular who I spoke about, Safiyah Bukhari and Na Abdul Qiyam. So Na actually was considered a teacher in his community. And so he was oftentimes, looked to as a moral example within the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army. And he talks about in his book, All Power to the People, how his belief in Allah and his following only the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam gave him a sense of focus, and it deterred like distractions from serving, other entities. So it made sure that you treated people with respect, that his conduct was pretty exemplary. Everybody that I heard speak of him and speak about him, or speak that knew him or speak about him, always talks about the fact that he was very fair, very just, very understanding. And we can, I feel like, conclude that Islam played a major role in that. Safiyah Bukhari as well, right? Mm-hmm. She talks about the fact that she didn't even believe in God around the time she joined the Black Panther Party. And we can see through reading her book some of the trials that she went through, how she relied on Allah. It was that Tawheed that she had that gave her the fortitude, once she accepted Islam, to struggle through and do a lot of work that in this era we're still really trying to play catch up on some of the things they were doing during that time, right? So Tawheed, number one, right? And then Zuhud was another thing we kind of talked about. One of the things I wanted to touch on. So they talk. Amir Abdul Malik talks about the fact that when El-Hajj Malik Shabazz died, he was basically the same body type as like Derek Jeter his rookie year, meaning that he was taking care of himself. He wasn't overeating, even though he was clearly well known in the community. And in the Black community, when you well known, you get fed. Like all you have to do is show up. You're like, have you eaten? Come here. We got this in the refrigerator, or whatever. People will be like, come stay at my nice place, or let me give you these access to all these resources that I have, whatever. But Malcolm was disciplined. And, he even talks about, people talk about the fact that not only that was he broke essentially when he died, but I'm pretty confident that he was broke, not because he didn't have access to resources, but because he wasn't hoarding them for himself. Mm-hmm. He wasn't driving around in a fancy car. He didn't have a mansion. He didn't have a penthouse suite or none of that. Zuhud allowed him to push these resources back into the movement in the community. So with both Na Abdul Qiyam and Safiyah Bukhari, who were not only members of the Black Panther Party and were given their time and resources into this organization, they were always also members of the Black Liberation Army, which, if you do a little study, was known for expropriations. Now, these expropriations sometimes, from some of the reports from the FBI, news reports, sometimes were excess of $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 plus dollars, right? So you hit a lick for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, like 6-7 times a year, right? Hypothetically,
right?
You set for a while. This is 1970. You set. You could be like, all right, take care of my family. I'm gone. Forget the struggle. Mm-hmm. But we know through history and through understanding what these resources were being used for. They were being used to finance the movement. Mm-hmm. Holistic health centers that help people cure chemical dependency, housing, food for hungry children before they go to school, whatever other means they needed. These resources weren't going into like nice shoes and Cadillacs when they were hitting these federally insured banks. You know, they practiced zuhud. You feel me? So they were like, all right, this isn't even our money. You know, this money belongs to the people.
So they were sacrificing their wealth that they were collecting.
Right.
For the struggle.
Right. When it could have been, I mean, to be honest, I don't think anybody would have faulted them if they like slid like 20, 30, 40, maybe even 100,000 to the side. But like, I deserve this. You know, I risked my life, but it was like, no, this goes to the struggle. So I think that's very important to talk about when we talk about why these people are successors of Malcolm. And I think this is a good format for us to analyze whether people meet that criteria. Because a lot of people, you know, they got like millions and dollar budgets and basically trying to tell you why Malcolm was a proud American. And so we see clearly that if you go and talk about people being connected or in the line of Malcolm's theory and practice, then you got to definitely talk about zuhud. You got to talk about the fact that, you know, these resources weren't hoarded for himself and he wasn't on some, okay, I don't engage. I'm just so spiritual. I'm off in the clouds somewhere by myself, getting thin and, you know, fasting every other day, but, you know, I don't do nothing to help the poor. So it's like, other than, you know, pray for them while I'm fasting. So it's like, you know.
Like a convenient spirituality.
Right. So I feel like when we talk about Malcolm and his successors, we have to talk about zuhud. And so the last point that that we know Amir Abdul Malik touched on in this khutbah was the fact that he wasn't afraid of death. And so we know that even Malcolm said that if a Black leader isn't ready to go to the grave, jail, or the hospital, then he's not fit. He or she is not fit to be a Black leader, right? So, and that even comes back to Tawheed, right? Because if you're afraid of death, then you don't have faith as a Muslim. You don't have faith in, you know, Allah's promise. You know, if you're afraid of death, then you're not afraid of displeasing your Creator. You're afraid of not being able to hold on to whatever temporary satisfactions you feel you get in the dunya. So El Hajj Malik Shabazz was detached from that. We see very clearly that people who were under threat of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Central Intelligence Agency, local police forces, politicians, reactionary elements within the Black community, all these different elements against these, you know, Black revolutionary Muslims. And in spite of that, internal contradictions, in spite of all of this, they decided to struggle, continue to struggle, you know, under whatever circumstances they were in and under whatever obstacles they faced. So I feel like this is a good way to analyze, especially when we're talking about, like, you know, who is like Malcolm or who is, like Malcolm or who is a successor to Malcolm. These three categories should be analyzed, and if they don't meet the criteria of all three, then I feel like it's an invalid analysis to say anything in regards to Malcolm with people. So that's why I feel like, and then I'm sure each three of these categories could be applied to all the successors of Malcolm. I just know specifically based off my study how it applies to these two people. So that's kind of what I wanted to, the first thing of what I wanted to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important question to struggle with, because nowadays there's so often the standard is just to mention Malcolm.
Right.
If you mention Malcolm and you compare yourself to Malcolm, you say you're like Malcolm, or you liked Malcolm, or what you think Malcolm would have said, or what you think Malcolm would have did. And I think for a lot of people, they think, you know, that's doing him justice, you know, that's honoring him and keeping his memory alive, etc. And maybe on some level it is, but I would challenge it a bit further to say that when you talk about Malcolm, you're talking about a man who was driven by divine principles. You know, you're talking about a man who was impeccable with his commitment and who embodied personal sacrifice in all these various aspects of his life. You know, and when we give ourselves more specific criteria, then it gives us a greater appreciation for what actually made him special. You know, what made him significant to us and why he continues to inspire people today, you know. And I think that, you know, taking it a step further, like you're saying, it necessarily it necessarily places some people in the same category, and it necessarily excludes certain people from that category. And that's not to be elitist per se, but that is to say that with someone who was so important historically, there should be a level of diligence, and there should be a level of, you know, there should be some high standards with regards to his legacy and his place in history. And it can't be watered down by comparing him to people who really don't fit the bill, you know. And so there are some criteria that we can use to see who are the likes of Malcolm, who are those who are like him, who are those who are comparable to him, you know. And one thing for me with thinking about this episode, that you know, the more I think about this subject that we're engaging with, the more I think about how, you know, Malcolm kind of took these different things which were a bit diffuse before him and embodied them and brought them together with a kind of precision and artfulness, you know, in terms of, you know, politics, politically, militarily, spiritually, socially, economically. There's all these different aspects in which he had these huge impacts on the community, because he was taking from all of the beneficial things that came before him. And he took the best from those things, and he studied them very diligently, and he absorbed them. And then he was able to then synthesize something that had the best elements from all the things that came before him. You know, and a lot of times, much of that gets attributed to Elijah Muhammad, and I don't want to go too far down that road, but when we see the changes and developments that took place under Malcolm's time and as an influential leader within the Nation of Islam, then you can see that, you know, he was really dedicated to putting these certain things into practice. He was really dedicated to taking the good from the Garveyite movement and the UNIA. And he was really dedicated to, you know, taking the good from the types of organizing that was coming out of the civil rights movement. You know, he was good for, you know, taking these good and beneficial elements and saying, look, you know, here is a scientific, spiritual approach to all of these various aspects that we have to deal with as a people. And he was good for, you know, sort of giving us a holistic perspective as to, you know, how all of these things have to be addressed, and all of these things impact us and have a direct impact on our circumstances, the situation we live in, our quality of life, etc. And so he embodied all of those things and then synthesized it and brought it forward in such a way that you could easily get it from him. You could easily hear him, and he'll use simple language, and you'll get the message. You'll hear it, you'll absorb it, and you'll then be able to put it into practice in such a way. And he was so effective that even just by hearing his speech, you can gain from him what he had absorbed and synthesized, you know. And so the point which I'm trying to make is that, you know, he took all of these things that were kind of diffused before him, and by using Islam as his model and platform of organizing, he brought it all together into, you know, the same places, the same time, the same room, etc., and the same programs. and then made it available for everyone, so that after he was martyred, it became diffuse, and it became what is known as the Black Power movement. It became the level, the advancement of the level of consciousness of the average Black youth after he was martyred, and the average ghetto youth after he was martyred, etc. It became diffuse among all of us to this day, to where, even us, as we're growing up as young people, that influence was heavy in our lives.
And if I could add something to that before Tanzine jumps in, and just what they call it, veggie back, not piggyback, but veggie backing off my brother. In regards to, I think that's also part of the reason why, I don't want to say it's easy, but why so many people attempt to co-opt his message, was because he represented or articulated a broad spectrum of interest within the Islamic and Black community. And because, he was able to articulate all of these different, this wide range of theoretical positions and synthesize it to within Islam, within Black liberation, I think some people have taken that as an invitation to say, this is what he was about, and leave out the other things that make the big picture. It's like when blind people are touching an elephant, right? If one person touches the trunk, they think that's what an elephant is. One person touches the back leg, they think that's what it is, but none of them get the whole picture. So, and Amir Abdul Malik teaches us about this too. Like when oftentimes people want to refer to Malcolm and his militancy, but leave out his morals. They leave out his spiritual base that guided his actions, and also guided his non-actions, what he did and did not allow to happen. Oftentimes we talk about the fact that he was brave. We don't talk about the fact that he was extremely moral, upright, and the fact that Islam is what gave him this. And before I pass the mic, I just wanted to read a part from the book by Yusuf Naim Clay, which is the Black book, The True Political Philosophies of Malcolm X, which kind of is a synthesis or a summary of like interviews that this brother in the OAAU did with Malcolm, and kind of like his viewpoints. So one thing when they talk about in the foreword of his biographical statement, they say, unlike most Americans, Haji Malik El-Shabazz accepted the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad while in prison for burglary in 1951 and 1952. At the age of about 22 years, refused to continue to bear and progenerate the name of the Anglo-American who had enslaved his ancestors, took X as his last name to signify this refusal and acceptance of the Islamic religion, and become a minister of the Nation of Islam, under the direction of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Shortly afterwards, under the guidance of Dr. Mahmoud Yusuf Shawarbi, Imam of the New York Islamic Center, Haji Malik El-Shabazz accepted Sunni Islam as his personal faith, made the Hajj to Mecca, and traveled to Africa, wherein he became engaged with the following three major concerns that occupied the remainder of his attention until his untimely death in the Audubon Ballroom that winter Sunday of 1965. Number one, the introduction of Islamic civilization into America, Muslim Incorporated, et cetera, et cetera. The introduction of the Afro-American question to the United Nations, which we see people now just kind of like actualizing, not to say people haven't been pushing this line, but we're seeing the fruits of this position that he took back then, especially when considered the all African nations on the continent of Africa basically charged the United Nations to investigate the abuses of Black people here in America. Three, the organization of an authentically internationally recognized Afro-American national liberation movement. And it says four, even though it was three, the replacement of irresponsible traditional Negro leadership. For without this, no meaningful changes of new conceptualizations could reach the masses. And I will go so far as to add to that and feel like I'm not overstepping my bounds in adding to that the replacement of irresponsible traditional Islamic leadership. At least, especially when they have feel the need or the ability to discuss Malcolm's politics or his practice. So I think it's important to read that because it goes right with what you're saying about the different things that Malcolm was synthesizing for us and why he's important, but also why so many people who, in my opinion, have nothing to do with what he believed in practice feel a right to claim a certain aspect, because he was so broad in everything that even some of the sellouts feel like, okay, well, I can relate to that too. And that was his goal, to like bridge the gap within the different ideological points within the Black community. So,
and you know what? And that says a lot about potential. That says a lot about potential, and you know how Malcolm imagined potential. Because when you talk about him bridging these gaps, you're talking about the potential that he saw in people, and recognizing that as a people, we're in a dysfunctional state. As a people, we're in a state of illness. Therefore, even the best among us have a bit of reforming to do. We have a bit of reforming of ourselves to do. Even the best among us, because of the state of illness that we are in collectively. And understanding that means that, you know, no one is where they need to be. That means when you're talking to a people, you're talking to a people in motion. You're talking to a people in development, right? So that when Malcolm was talking to people, he was talking to people as if seeing the spectrum of their development, as if understanding that when you hear me, you might be in a state of ignorance. You might be in a state of spiritual death. You might be in any number of states. But through the process and through the time of you getting exposed to the truth, and, you know, this process being laid out for you, the method being laid out for you, the struggle being laid out for you, your eyes being open to the truth, right? That you are going to go through a process of development. And he has something for you at all the stages in that development. So that when he talked to you, the message hit you in your ignorant state and got your attention. You could hear it. In a state of ignorance, you could hear the message. And as you grow and come out of your ignorance and start to reform yourself and refine yourself, you find more and more gems inside of the same message, you know, and that's the potential. And that's the potential of people, you know. But at the same time, there is the state, there is the empire, which also preys upon that same potential. Because the potential for revolutionary struggle, the potential for, you know, spiritual awareness, taqwa, God consciousness, higher awakening, that same potential is, you know, it's like a process that has like an arc, if you will, of development, you know, from ignorance into consciousness and, you know, discipline and refinement of self. That arc can be shifted towards other things, so that when the people get themselves organized and they're moving in motion towards this revolutionary potential, the system is good at offering them little detours and little side things to circumvent the destination that you're headed towards. And I think that's what some people, that's what we see some people are doing actually with regard to referencing Malcolm and maybe comparing themselves to Malcolm, or, you know, saying things that Malcolm, you know, Malcolm would have did this, Malcolm would have did that. You know, like there was a guy who he seemed pretty intelligent and educated, and you know, he was saying something about you know, Malcolm would have been a part of that ADOS movement, and it's something that it's like, okay, you're listening, and you know, this person's sounding intelligent, and you know, you're making sense, and then they take a sharp left turn, and you're like, wait, what? Where are we going now? You know, like, you like which car, which bus am I on again? You know, and you know, and so I think that's one of those examples where there's a lot of potential in terms of, you know, sort of the emotions and the issues that get taken up in the question of ADOS. There's a lot of potential in terms of, you know, grievances of the descendants of slaves, you know, but then it gets tripped up in this sort of preventative trap that, you know, it has to be some patriotic American thing. Right. It has to be some anti-Black, anti-African thing. You know what I mean? And it has to be some, you know, it has to be a type of Blackness that serves America's foreign policy agenda. So that's when we got to be really critical thinkers, because, okay, yeah, I'm a descendant of slaves in America. Does that make me an American descendant of slaves? Right. No, it doesn't. It doesn't. If I'm sitting at the table, doesn't mean I'm eating. Right. I ain't even sitting at the table. As a matter of fact, I'm the footstool at the table. They got their feet on my back. So how I'm gonna then call myself an enjoyer of the meal? No, we're not that thing. So that's a tricky kind of thing, because when you're dealing with people coming out of ignorance, that might seem like totally revolutionary. You know, and so it's one of those things, because you're dealing with a potential. When you're talking about coming out of ignorance, you're talking about a potential for growth. You can grow into these. There's so much potential now that you're moving out of the small box of ignorance, right? And so then that potential gets seized upon, you know, by the state, by the empire, and you know they use it to bolster and reinforce other agendas that they have, you know. And so that's something that we got to think about too. Is like, okay, how do we deal with potential? How do we deal with people in transition? And I think one problematic thing that's come up in the last decade is this idea of, you know, more revolutionary than now. You know, this like holier than now. Holier than now is still a thing. So those spiritual people, they think they're more spiritual than you. Those people are still a problem. But there's also, too, the ones who think that they're so much more revolutionary than you. And you know, what's wrong with your backwards, archaic caveman ways? You know what I'm saying? And so that's become a thing, too. And I think that my understanding of that is it's a problematic approach to potential, because you're talking about the intermingling of different levels of consciousness and different ideological commitments. So that's potential. It's like that's a potential that, depending on how it's configured, can go in different directions and can produce different results. But people take a wrong approach to it, and they make it an exclusive, elitist type of thing, where it's like, oh, you didn't use the correct language. Right. That means you're an oppressor. It's a short step from you used the wrong language to you're oppressing me. Right. You know what I mean? And I think that is dealing with the question of potential. Right? Because it's dealing with people in transition, people who are coming from the system's way of living, the system's way of doing things, what the system taught them to be and conditioned them to be, and searching for something better for themselves, searching for a greater purpose, a higher purpose, and not really knowing what's the best, you know, stumbling through the options that are available. And now, you know, it's like there's so many options. There's so many options of what it is to be revolutionary, or what social change means, or what social justice means, or just what justice means. There's so many options that, you know, it's kind of like you're gonna stumble if you just got exposed to something. Maybe you saw a speech, or you saw someone got killed and you saw it in the news, and it triggered something, and you started your journey towards, realization of a higher justice. you're gonna stumble. You're gonna stumble through things, and it's stuff that's being contended over. This ideology is contending with this ideology, and so there's this great potential. And I think that Malcolm, as well as his successors, they had a beautiful way of dealing with potential. You know, which is to say, they focused on the people in transition. They weren't organizing a body of perfect revolutionaries. They weren't organizing a body of more revolutionary than now or holier than thou or whatever. They weren't organizing that. They were organizing the inhabitants of the ghetto. They were organizing the people in prison. They were organizing their people in the various dysfunctional and various oppressed and subjugated spaces and places, positions they found themselves in. And I think that model is something that Malcolm exemplified for us beautifully in his commitment to this idea of fishing. You know, that he would go out where his brothers and sisters were, and he would fish them right out of the gutter where they are. And I think that is the correct, if one can say there's a correct approach, I think that's the correct approach to potential. He didn't go to them and ridicule them for their ignorance. He went to them with an extended hand to say, you know, we are developing and we're refining a method of pulling ourselves out of the mental, emotional, spiritual, you know, psychological slavery that we're stuck in, that was placed upon you. That wasn't your fault that you got placed into, but you find yourself in it and you need a way out. So I'm extending a hand. I'm running a class. I'm providing food. I'm giving a demonstration of some effective ways for you to gain control over yourself, gain control over your life, gain control over your community and your destiny, which is like night and day compared to some of the things that we see today. Whereas someone might have a revolutionary spirit, but their language isn't right, so they get ridiculed. Or they don't have all of the, every component of the deen right, so they get ridiculed. They don't have, you know, there's some little things that we find, you know, displeasing, distasteful, etc. There's some little things about them that makes them, they're not a perfect leader. They're not a perfect chairman of the party. They're not a perfect imam. You know what I'm saying? And so instead of encouraging them, instead of lifting them up and providing them with the kind of stability and encouragement that helps foster growth and development, you know, they're treated with a fear and anxiety. You're gonna get us in trouble. You're probably a snitch. You're probably working for the FBI because you keep talking that revolutionary stuff. You don't even know your dean, so you know you're just gonna get us all. You're gonna lead us all to the hellfire because you're so focused on revolution, but you don't even know your dean. You know what I'm saying? And so there's these things, and these are issues that one should deal with. It's not like it's not important issues, but, and this is comes back to the approach and the approach towards potential. How do you see potential? Are you afraid of potential, or do you see potential as power? Do you see potential as, you know, this is an opportunity that we can actually do something, and that more can come from this potential? So we got two questions now.
Well, can I?
Some things.
We'll get to the questions for sure. I just wanted to add that the points that Abdurrahman had raised earlier about a comment that Amir Abdul Malik always mentions about how after Malcolm's martyrdom, some of the organizations that came after him, even the militant ones, that they took his militancy but did not take his morals. I want to actually kind of invert that for today, which is Muslim Americans, and I'll read a little survey that's been done. Muslim Americans, a lot of them, particularly the ones who want to talk about Malcolm a lot, they took Islamic morals, but they took no militancy at all. So they turned Malcolm into like the early Martin, not even, right? So, MLK was getting arrested, going to things and organizing. I mean, we're talking about just flowery speeches, right? Talking about, so over historicizing Malcolm in a very kind of specific kind of academic way, which is also not very serious academia. So it's all completely bad. So I'm going to read like this little survey that was done recently. I read in Middle East Eye, the magazine published this study, which was done over the course of 5 months of Muslim Americans of all types. So according to this survey, which was held over a period of 5 months, and opinions of respondents from Black, Arab, Middle Eastern, South Asian, and white Muslim Americans, more than 80% of the respondents said they felt civil rights issues were more important to them than foreign policy of America. That's the status of the deen in America. That's Westoxified Muslims. That's westernized Muslims. That's the domesticated Muslims. That's the Mudajjin. And there was another term, the version of the Mudajjin, which is also what Brother Sindiata was talking about, which was the Christianized kind of domesticated Muslims, the Moors who stayed, who didn't have Moriscos. Yeah, and exactly. Yeah. So one of the things that, to me, that's really relevant for this Successor series is for us to think about some of the things that we discussed that actually does not separate militancy from morality. Militancy is part of morality. Morality has to be ingrained in the militant work that we do. So it is not like two different things that we can participate and compartmentalize and split up Malcolm into different parts, right? So his politics is not separated from his spirituality. Brother talked about zuhud as a very important quality where you want to sacrifice your wealth. Because, the class composition, and this is for our Islamic audience, because I try to always provide a narrative that allows for international observers to understand what we're talking about, is that the Islamic movement, the class composition was not always about poor versus rich. There's a lot of Islamic movement people who have purified their wealth by using that wealth to, like build a bridge into that, okay? They've done that stuff like that. There's been mujahids who've done extensive work that they've collected and taken out wealth from like the royal families and engaged in struggle and used that money for redistributing and things like that. So it's important to understand that there has to be a degree of detachment from the world. That's zuhud, to be detached from the dunya and you're focused on the akhirah. There's two types of people when it comes to Islam. Those who are attached to the dunya and those who are attached to the akhirah. Now, a lot of Marxists are going to call this fatalists. Marxist humanists are going to call Muslims fatalists because, and I saw, and I want to bring this up, on the internet, there was an article which had lots of important points. It was a Marxist article which talked about how there is a martyrdom is not necessarily a good goal because it can stop, political work that's about militarily winning. As far as Muslims go, though, nothing is higher than we have to please Allah. So Allah is most pleased when someone gives his life for the cause of Islam, not for any worldly revolution. No worldly. So that doesn't mean that we're just in a cave and not talking to the world and not doing anything. It just means that Islam does not work according to a humanist understanding of fatalism because they don't believe in God. They don't believe in the afterlife. To them, people are just trying to die. They don't have an understanding of the difference between suicide and martyrdom. Very different. Mothers in Kashmir are telling their boys and their children, go ahead and give your life for Kashmir, for Islam. They're saying that. And that's very different from the dude who writes a letter about how much despair they have and they want to die and take their own lives. You know, that's very different than Islamic martyrdom. So we have to understand and have a sense of what that means. And I think Malcolm was a perfect example of someone who did not fear death and died for the cause to please Allah. And we know that from his speeches. Of course, he died for the liberation of his people, but it was connected to his understanding that Islam would be the most important framework to do so. And it was always very clear. And the other thing which I think Hannibal brought up, which is this connection and ability that Malcolm had to not be an alienated person. So he was always about being able to look at various experiences and various political tendencies and see the benefits in those tendencies instead of immediately looking at what he doesn't agree with. So that's very significant. And I think this is where RAM, we're discussing some of the things that we find useful. This is where Malcolm's engagement with RAM, which is a secular organization, was so significant. Muhammad Ahmed becomes Muslim, even though he's participating in a Maoist Marxist-Leninist framework. Malcolm was interested in what are some of the good things about that kind of analysis. So we are going to see, and this is the contemporary relevance thing, which I want to quickly touch on. We are going to see now, especially because we're not living in Muslim lands, we're living in a different kind of land, all kinds of political tendencies as the United States is going through these phases. And now with Minnesota, it seems to have gone through a very different stage. So we're going to be seeing, and this is why I like what Muhammad Ahmed was talking about, is being engaged in different spaces where you can engage with Islam. Because if Muslim Americans, 80% of them are interested in just civil rights and recognition from the white man, then we do have to engage with others. There's no room. So we do have to begin to engage with others and turn those militants into Muslims. That's really in other places. That's actually kind of important and intelligent in my view. And which doesn't mean that we don't work with American Muslims. I mean, of course, there's going to be many who are going to be very good. I mean, there's still that 20% who are interested in thinking about United States foreign policy. And what that means also internally. See, the American Army and the American police are deeply connected. They're almost like the same thing in many ways. So there cannot be a contradiction that denouncing the police, but not really denouncing the military that much. Denouncing the military, but being friendly with cops. These are all serious contradictions that has to be confronted. And I think those are some of the things that I would mention, and we can pick up on the questions and other things that you want to add and so on. So.
Yeah, I think that's, we're dealing with, like, as the Muslims in America, we're dealing with this state of, it's like that children's story, The Emperor's New Clothes,
right,
where it's like everybody knows what kind of state this is. Everybody knows what kind of government this is.
Right.
Everybody knows how it behaves and how it deals with its problems, how it conducts itself, and how it honors its commitments, etc. Everyone knows these things, yet somehow American Muslim leadership is still committed to the most un-Islamic agenda in history.
Right.
Like when we look at the American agenda, when we look at the policies and the practices,
right,
the policies themselves are anti-Islamic.
Right.
And even if you thought those policies weren't, their adherence, their selective adherence to their laws and non-adherence to their laws, their non-compliance with international law, all of these different ways in which they conduct themselves as like the embodiment of arrogance, as the embodiment of no principles, right, of not being accountable to anything, right, of corrupt power. And somehow, these quote unquote leaders are still pandering for alliances and cooperation with politicians who are obviously corrupt. I mean, a child, my niece who's 7, can look at these people and see they're obviously corrupt, and somehow men who are supposed to be our elders and who are supposed to be our leaders and our advisors and guides and etc. Can't see it. So it's like the emperor's new clothes. It's like you walking around naked and you're the only one who can't see that you're naked because you out here promoting the most corrupt agenda in history, the most corrupt agenda in history, and you running around here like you don't look like a fool. You look like a fool. You look like you either got bought off cheap or you're too stupid to even understand what you yourself are promoting. Right. And I don't want to accuse you of neither one of those things, so I'm just saying that's what you look like. Right. That's what you look like. I'm not saying that's what you're doing. I'm saying that's what you look like. So I'm still yet to understand, and there may be some deeper Islamic knowledge that I'm lacking to understand how you make those moves, and I'm open to that possibility. But I think enough of us are really tired of that kind of hypocrisy, and we're tired of being told, don't believe your lying eyes. I can do the thinking for the whole community. I've thought about this, and I find it honorable, despite the fact that thousands of you, millions of you, find it corrupt and shady. My perspective is much more enlightened than all of yours, and thus, my Islamic knowledge makes it okay and acceptable. That's what we're dealing with. That's what we're dealing with. This was not Malcolm. These are the people who have nothing to do with Malcolm. They have nothing to do with Malcolm. Doesn't mean they won't say his name. And doesn't mean they won't compare themselves. It is what it is. So, but we have to understand that too, like as Muslims, we have to understand that in America, we're dealing with influences that are not clear and obvious in terms of the average imam or whoever, this guy who's promoting this stuff, the sheikh or whatever he is not coming from his Islamic knowledge. It's not coming from his Islamic knowledge. It's coming from the RAND Group's analysis of foreign policy and military intelligence. Okay? It's coming from a military analysis on how to best keep the Muslims under control. And if you study foreign policy, if you study military intelligence and military strategy, if you read some of the documents that the RAND Group has published, and then if you look at the talking points of some of these celebrity imams, you'll see a consistent pattern that's like taken straight out of the playbook written by the RAND Group. So,
are you saying democratic Sufism is not
democratic
civil society Sufism is not,
democratic centralism? You know what I'm saying? I mean, these things, it's funny, the kind of stuff that people get into, because it's kind of like, because there's not like a high standard of leadership here, because like serious leaders have been targeted and, neutralized, assassinated, locked up, and all these different things that have happened to really sincere leaders. There's not a high standard, so it's like an anything goes type of thing. And it's like if 60% of the congregation knows that it's nonsense and garbage, it still can fly because you got 40% that's going to help it keep moving. Right. You know what I'm saying? And so that's part of the problem, That's part of the problem is that there's no standard. Because if we had higher standards of Islamic adherence, not, higher standards of who can do rhetorical acrobatics and who can take Islamic law and twist it and flip it to match the Rand group's policies. That's not what I'm talking about. You know what I'm saying? That's not a high standard. That's a very low standard. You know what I mean? But when we talk about a high standard, you're talking about someone who looks at the complexity of the situation they're in and what their congregation is facing and comes up with intelligent ways for their congregation to adhere to Allah's laws. Not to come up with creative ways to make the people of justice, to make the spiritual people, the people of justice, adhere to the laws of man. That's not good leadership, and that's what we're facing with. You know, that's what we're dealing with. So, but anyway, I don't want to go on forever. I know we got a couple questions.
Yeah, there's one on there. And
you want to say something, bro?
Yeah, please do.
Okay. So
I'm disagreeing with you.
Let me see. Give me 1 second, guys. Sorry.
More like a comment.
Okay, so I'm gonna read this comment. I would have loved to see you all discuss the women in Malcolm's life that were so impactful regarding his leadership success, especially his sister Ella Collins and Dr. Beta Shabazz. I often focus on them as they, like many African American Muslim women's contributions, remain invisible. So, yeah, my initial response to that is that there's a lot of things that we didn't focus on. There's a lot of people that we didn't focus on, and that has a lot to do with the point of this series, which was to highlight people who carried on his legacy after he passed away, which is to highlight people who, you know, embodied the role that he played. So people who carried on the role that he played. Yeah, I mean, there's that, man, there's a number of ways to approach that. And I think that, you know, it's something that we had a comment early on when we got started about, you know, having more focus on women. And I think that, you know, it's nothing wrong with that, but I think that was not the focus of the successors. So when we talk about the successors of Malcolm X, we're talking about, you know, essentially carrying on a legacy, right? When you think about his sister, for example, you're talking about someone who played a role in his life that was essential, absolutely essential to the history, etc. Was essential to the movement, etc. But it's not the same thing as, for instance, someone who is picking up the torch and carrying it forward. And the reason why that distinction is important.
One of our participants is saying, "Hey, you guys remember you guys talking about Safiyah Bukhari?" Not to interrupt.
Yeah, so we did talk about Safiyah Bukhari, but and you know, we consider her as carrying on the legacy.
Exactly.
You know, and one of the reasons that this is significant, why this is important, is because when we're talking about understanding the legacy, right? Because part of the reason that we made this series is seeing like wrong kinds of comparisons.
Mm-hmm.
Seeing people being compared to Malcolm X who don't fit the bill, right?
Mm-hmm.
So wanting to be diligent about, you know, who carried on the legacy, who picked up the torch, and who, you know, carried that forward,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if we wanted to talk about everything to do with Malcolm's life, that would be a different kind of program.
Right.
If we wanted to talk about all the people who helped him and supported him, we definitely didn't cover half enough people for that.
Right.
And in fact, the people that we've been talking about are not people who even work with him directly.
Right.
With the exclusion of Muhammad Ahmad and Sekou Odinga, those were the only two people that we're discussing who actually engaged with him directly. And so that really wasn't the focus of this.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, I think it's a natural inclination for people to look at a program and say, well, I'd like to see you guys cover this and cover that. And there's nothing wrong with that at all, you know. But that's a different conversation than, you know, who are the successors of Malcolm X. And I think that, you know, and I'm open to being corrected on this, but as it relates, I didn't see the area where we would have focused on them to make points about the successors. I think with regard to visibility, I think one mistake that people make sometimes is to think that visibility equals appreciation. So that's something that's very common in secular movement, whereas if, you know, if you're not being put on display, that means somehow your work is less valuable.
If your wife is not in the reading group, then you're a patriarch because she's not going to some reading group that the seculars have organized.
She
may have been doing really important work for the struggle that people don't really see in liberalism.
Right. Yeah, and we have a lot of examples from history of people who quietly played very essential roles and very important roles, and you know, they were never like made as like the upfront or the out front personality. And I think that I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Personally, I don't think there's anything wrong with that because I don't personally see visibility as equating to value, equating to importance. And that's part of the reason why we're doing this series, because historically people have made that equation of the people who are most visible are most important. So if you saw some iconic picture of someone, they might not have done anything but take that picture. Because you saw them in that picture, they're important now, right? And so we wanted to, you know, we wanted to highlight these people who, you know, carried on the legacy, but they didn't get as much notoriety as Malcolm X, right? And one of the reasons that we wanted to do that was because we wanted to illustrate, you know, okay, you guys are familiar with Malcolm, but here is what these people did in this situation, which we think this is what Malcolm would have done if he was in their situation, or, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But it's, you know, I mean, I think a lot of times people want to see like, well, you know, these people were famous, so, you know, other people should be equated to them, and, you know, we should be presenting people in this particular way of equality, et cetera, et cetera. And I mean, ultimately, that's not what we're doing. I mean, the series is meant to illustrate for people how the legacy was carried on, some things that people may not understand, the details of certain history. But yeah, I think, I think definitely it would be worth it for someone to profile them and talk about the details of their life and all of that stuff. But I think that that would be very different than what we're doing here. Yeah, so, and I think, and I would discourage people from looking for that everything has to fit and be compared to what has been the historical model. You know what I mean? Like, because those people weren't highlighted the same way they should be highlighted the same way. I don't think that has to happen. I think we should value those roles and as they are. Everyone doesn't need to be chairman of the party. That's just, I mean, that's my personal thinking, because I've dealt with organizations where they feel like, if you're not out in the front on the microphone in front of the camera, that you're not having an important role, or that you're not having enough influence, and that, you have to put women out on the forefront just to prove the fact that women are involved and, this kind of thing. And I personally find that to be counterintuitive to revolutionary organizing.
So there are a couple of questions. Do y'all want to read this one? There's one here that was sent earlier in the email, and then there's that one that you want to take that one.
I mean, what's the other question? I mean, I'll take either one. But
the other question is, this is the question. I'm gonna read it. One of the questions I'm wondering about, located in Europe, how Malcolm's experience and insights as a Black Muslim can be translated to not only our 21st century, but to European contexts, and where such act of translation might find their limits. So basically, how is Malcolm relevant to European context, I think? And when we make that translation, what are the limits of that? I have a thing to say about that, but you guys...
Please.
Go for it, man. Yeah. I'm still wrapping my head around that.
Because I think the question is a bit of an act.
I've never been to Europe, so that might be part of the problem.
Haven't done much study of
Europe came to me.
Struggle either.
I think the way I would answer this is sort of how we've been, in milestones, sort of for the last whole year, how we've been approaching history is we've been looking at history in which Europe and America has a relationship of white supremacy. And we've been talking about it in terms of like how when we were talking to Frank Wilderson's work and so on, and the relevance of that, and then Ward Churchill's work about Native genocide and the relevance of that, we're trying to show that prior to Europe's construction, American genocide already had started. Prior to European capitalism emerging, American genocide already started. So when Malcolm is talking about, and he's going to England to give his Oxford speech and so on, he's contacting people who are like West Indians in Europe or South Asians in England. And he's trying to understand, and Muslims there, and Arabs and Algerians and so on. He's trying to understand that world. And he's trying to see how did, quote unquote, the white man impact globally the world and in its various mechanisms of colonialism and slavery. So one of the things that we are trying to show in our work is a relationship between slavery and its impact and its afterlife, and colonialism and its impact and its afterlife. So once we see that, then we see that Malcolm X becomes very relevant, because he does talk about African and Asian leaders who were fighting colonialism specifically. So that's a European intervention, right? And then he's saying, look, Americans are doing this, and there's a comparison here to be made. But, today's world, there's a leftist notion of solidarity, which often becomes very shallow, because what we try to do in our journal and our conversations is to show how anti-Black violence is foundational to the creation of the world and the creation of Europe itself. And in that sense, this translation is not even a translation. It's a category within the category of America expanding itself and creating a world and helping Europe to create itself. And then we know the expansion of that, Europe goes everywhere and colonizes, etc. So I think internally then, inside Europe, there has to be, that would be my take, conversations on Malcolm's travels to Europe and his conversations as to why he was taking those trips to elite places like Oxford so seriously. Why wasn't he? And at the same time, we all know how connected he was to the grassroots. And it was because the Oxford Union speech was about the students who were actually fighting for housing rights in Oxford, and they were being discriminated against, etc. And so it was very significant for him. So there's a direct link. So when Malcolm thinks about, the category of the white man, it's a whole economy, it's a whole structure, it's a whole system. It's not just empirical white people. And so Europe is a big component to that. And so, I think that is the connection. I think that's the best answer I can give. Please do email us. I just got this message, so I don't know who the person is. So thank you for this question. We're going to address this more. And please, if you have more things to add, do add that.
Yeah, follow up if we're not fully answering that.
Yeah.
Or any other question, like feel free to follow up. Okay, so I'm gonna read this other question. Let's see. I think it's second part. Okay. What about Khalid Muhammad? Could he be considered a successor, or is Orthodox Islam a prerequisite to be a successor? So, I mean, in just a really simple answer, I think yes. I would say yes, because it's an essential part of the principles. It's an essential part of the principles is Tawheed. Mm-hmm. I think shirk, and the reason I mention shirk is because my understanding of Khalid Muhammad is that he went from Nation of Islam, which is a form of shirk, into another form of shirk, having to do with ancestors and rituals for ancestors. So I would say, yeah, like, he's not in the same field because he was operating from shirk. So I would say he's not had the same values, but even still beyond that, even if they had the same values, in terms of his presence and his impact, I would say it's really not comparable. Why I would say that is because a number of things. Number one, he didn't have the influence that Malcolm had. He wasn't involved in the same type of projects. I think one can be inclined to compare the two because they're, noteworthy. They were, controversial in the media. Great orators, etc. But I would say, personally, I struggle to see the consistency between the two. Whether the personality or just the presence, etc. I'm open to suggestions as to why someone might think that they're very similar. I think, mostly what they get compared to one another for is making speeches about racism, about, being proud to be Black, etc. Coming out of the Nation of Islam. And yeah, we're definitely not of the opinion that the Nation of Islam created Malcolm X. So that's, I think there's a lot of people who are of that opinion. We know Nation of Islam is of the opinion that they invented Malcolm X, created him, and everything that he did was either the good things that he did was because of them, or the bad things that he did was because of his own arrogance or whatever they're saying, right? But we're not of that belief. You know, we're not of the belief that, you know, that they are solely responsible for his consciousness and development. So, yeah, I mean, I would say Malcolm was committed to a different set of values and principles. And I think, you know, Tawheed was at the core of it, because, you know, what you can see in Malcolm is that over the years he spent in the public, you find a man that becomes more and more humble and more militant at the same time. Mm-hmm. You find a man who becomes more and more clear, more and more focused, you know, coming away from the Nation of Islam, etc. And arguably, it's very different for Khalid Muhammad. Arguably, you're talking about someone who was, you know, struggling on the basis of shirk, under the idea of, you know, God walking the earth as a man, under the idea of a false prophet, and then going from that and being kicked out of that, and then kind of just, you know, going off in this other direction. So
I'd like to add to that too. In veggie backing off what the brother said. That's my new term. Y'all gonna get tired of me saying it. No more piggybacking. But I think to add to that, one, in regards to the people that we've highlighted in this series, right? They meet a certain criteria, and every single one of them. It's the fact that, you know, they follow the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and I think also that, well, of course, that they were Black, and that, you know, definitely they all at least have some conceptualization about Black people being a colony within the United States, and also they all the people that we've mentioned as successors have, in some way or shape, in my opinion, worked and organized to actualize a lot of what Malcolm theorized, and what Malcolm was summarizing and synthesizing for us, that, you know, he was martyred prior to actually getting a chance to implement. A lot of the people all of the people that we've mentioned here, I think in some way, shape, or form, were practicing, which were working towards the actualization of a lot of what Malcolm taught.
And you know what? I'm sorry, but there's something you said that made me think of something too, right? Another thing you may notice with the people we chose to focus on, aside from perhaps one we haven't got to yet, which is Imam Jamil Al-Amin. Aside from him, pretty much everyone else that we focus on was not like in the public eye the way Malcolm was. Mm-hmm. So we didn't choose to focus on people who were like these celebrity personalities. And this kind of goes back to the other question about some of the women around Malcolm. Because, you know, we didn't just pick people that they were celebrities, or that, you know, we wanted to put the spotlight on them, etc. But that when Malcolm gave his speeches and gave his classes, it was certain things that he highlighted. There were certain principles that he drove home, and these people then took them up after he was martyred. They took them up and put them into practice. Mm-hmm. And they manifested them in the different organizations they were in. They manifested them in various different ways without seeking the same type of publicity that he did. They said, okay, Malcolm came and taught us to do this. He told us to do A, B, and C. We're going to get busy doing that. And they put their nose to the grindstone, and they just worked hard on the things that he taught them about. Mm-hmm. And that's, you know, that's the main quality which we see as making them successors because they took up all of his issues, they took up all of his causes, and focused on putting them into practice and spreading them. And so, they weren't focused on giving speeches in the same way that he was. They did classes, but even still, that was different than what Malcolm was doing. They were focused on taking it the next length of distance. So if we're doing a relay race, he brought it to here, so they weren't running the same length of track he ran. They took the baton and went the next length. Mm-hmm. So they didn't just do what he did, but they took what he did and where he left off, and they went forward from there. And so that's really the main, why are they successors? Because they took up his causes and made sure that they didn't fall into the dust when he was martyred.
The only thing I would add to the Khalid Muhammad question is, the nation question is that Allah used the nation to bring him into some understanding. And then Allah also allowed for Malcolm to leave and embrace real Islam. And it was really interesting to think about how Malcolm's martyrdom, Islamic martyrdom, was possible because of his transition out of the nation. And that's a beautiful thing because it's the highest form of death. So that's the only thing I would add to that question. Is there another question you're reading? Amber looks serious.
It's not a question.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I would like to add something. I don't know how much time we have left, but in regards to like current events, so we know that even though he was a speaker, a public speaker, a lot of the more militant things that we know that was a part of Malcolm's program that who we've chosen as successors are, the things that they tried to bring into fruition weren't necessarily in all of his public speeches. And you'd only be able to find them through your either conversations or study of those that were with him and around him and some of the positions he took. They weren't necessarily loud. They weren't necessarily, even though he was a fiery speaker, a lot of the more hardline positions that we know he took from listening to or reading Muhammad Ahmed and other people who were close with him in organizing and weren't necessarily on the microphone at the OAAU public meetings. We know that, he was quiet about it. And I know Tanzine talked a little bit earlier in some of the successors of Malcolm's series about how Robert F. Williams was a little critical of Malcolm in regards to him being so open about the things he talked to, and Malcolm being humble and full of humility, accepted the criticism, and so we see that with Malcolm and with the successors of Malcolm, there was a lot of behind the scenes work, and I think that's important, a lot of more quiet work that we need to pay attention in this time and place, because considering how much the violence against us as Black people, as Muslims, is being sensationalized in the media. People are being, not sensationalized, but being blown up and thrown in our face in the media. A lot of people are resorting to things that I think are strategically incorrect or not smart. And so, we see this big spectacle of us being attacked. We feel like we got to respond with an equally big spectacle of the fact and beat on our chest and say we're not afraid, when the reality is it ain't a matter of us being afraid. It's a matter of us being out organized. And in this era that we're in, I think it's important to remember what Russell Maroon Schultz also talked about in Black Fighting Formation. So he says that drawing a sword is, or rattling a sword is loud. Drawing one is silent, right? And so we know a lot of the people who were working with Malcolm towards some of these ideas of drawing swords were not necessarily getting up on Phil Donahue and making speeches about it. So we know that there's a clear distinction between all of the people who are successors in which we analyze. They weren't loud hop up on the podium, take over the microphone, claim my organization's better than yours, you're not revolutionary enough. They were behind the scenes putting in the work that, was the transition. They didn't imitate what Malcolm did. Right. They built off the program that he laid the foundation for, So I think that's important to remember in regards to not only the question, but also organizing in present day, right? Because we see, there's groups, and it's definitely great, I think, to have like legal gun clubs and like a bunch of different things that push the limit and exercise our right, our so-called right to, defend ourselves. But the reality is, if we're talking about, attack positions against the system, right? Or we're talking about offensive measures against the system. That's not something that you put on your Facebook and you broadcast live. And we see the results of it, even with, and I definitely want to not discourage people who are getting active and feeling like, they want to be a part of something, they're willing to commit themselves fully, but we got to be aware about ways in which we can easily be deterred from victory by, spreading our plans out in the open, like loose sink ships. So if you're telling everybody what you're finna do, don't be surprised when your enemies show up prepared to defeat you. So I think it's important that we recognize that all of these successors, they moved in the shadows. They didn't seek attention. And not to say that there's not a role for people who need to speak to the issues and need to speak for those doing quiet work.
But, and if I could jump in too, and just to beat a dead horse, because this is an important point that I think is easy to skip over, which is that we did this series because we felt like there was some specific history that people either weren't aware of or they weren't engaging with in a way that we hoped that people could, right? So there were specific points and principles that we see coming from Malcolm that some people seem to have missed. And so we created this series and we picked individuals as a means of getting at those tendencies, getting at those traditions, getting at those historical phenomena. So you'll find that we picked people who were not the most visible of their generation. They weren't the most visible in their organization. Maybe there's people you may even think fit the bill better. Like there was someone who was pressing us to have Dhoruba bin Wahad involved with this. And whereas I think that's a potentially great idea, right? And there's so much history that he could break down and talk about. One of the reasons why we chose not to focus on him for this series is because he's already so well known. Because so many people are already so familiar with him, and his life experience, etc., is available in a way that some of this history is not. And so we wanted to really focus on these things because there was certain principles which we wanted to elucidate for people. And in elucidating those principles to people, we didn't want to say, oh, well, we think this is important, so you should think it's important too. Well, no, we wanted to give historical examples of why do we think these things are important. And so the real focus was the principles which we were trying to elucidate. And so you'll find it's not a roster of everyone that was impacted by Malcolm. It's not a roster of the people in his life. It's not by any means a list of all the important people that had anything to do with Malcolm. That's definitely not. We would have been seriously lacking if that's what we were trying to do. Right. We were very specifically focused on certain principles. And so, I think, for some people asking, well, how come, these people aren't here, or how come Khalid Muhammad, or how come his sister, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's very specific to the fact that we felt these people embody something that doesn't get dealt with enough. So we focused on them in order to deal with the questions that we felt don't get dealt with enough. And so each person that we focused on had a very specific utility in that way, that they captured something, embodied something at its core that was essential, that we felt was essential to the conversation. And so, yeah, I mean, I completely understand, you know, this, one of the comments that we got was about the lack of visibility of Black women in the way that we tell these stories sometimes. And I think, you know, that is absolutely a legitimate concern. And I think that if we were telling a story of the people of Malcolm, the people he knew and interacted with, or even just the people who followed him, and we're just talking about everybody who followed him, I think that would be very important and central to that representation. But I think that, you know, as viewers, we ask that you take a minute to appreciate that there was something missing that we were trying to bring through. There was something missing in the conversation around Malcolm that we were trying to bring through, that we felt equipped and knowledgeable enough to bring through, that we were confident in our knowledge to bring some of these things through. And I think if there was some other focus that didn't come through, it's either because it wasn't our primary goal, or maybe we weren't knowledgeable enough to do it. Because we're not experts. We're not experts on Malcolm. We're not experts on everyone who was in his life or knew him. Definitely not experts. We're dealing with some issues that we're familiar with, that we feel there's a scarcity of engagement on those topics. And so that's why we chose to focus on the people that we chose to focus on. But I think that, like, whenever someone suggests, okay, what about this person? My initial reaction is, it sounds like you're getting ready to present. You know what I'm saying? Because
you ain't giving us
you're volunteering me to present on somebody that you're perhaps more qualified to present on than myself.
Yeah, we'd love to see some series on that kind of stuff.
I mean, seriously, and I would engage. And if you send me an invitation, I absolutely will attend, ask questions and everything. So if there's someone in here that we didn't cover that you felt like, man, they should have talked about this, that's a need. If you feel that there's something missing there, and that's how we felt and how we came up with this series. So in the same respect, if you feel like we're missing something, there's a need that you could fulfill, and we're not hostile to that at all. We would encourage it. We would promote it. If you send us a link or a flyer, we'll circulate it. We'll promote it and encourage people to engage with it. Inshallah.
Inshallah. I think we're pretty much close to being done.
We got any more questions out there? Anybody? Any more questions or follow up if we didn't fully answer the question right?
Abdul Rahman, did you want to add something? I feel like you might have something else to say. I mean,
no. I mean, as far as this one, I think we've kind of touched everything in general that I wanted to discuss for this segment. I just kind of wanted to, I think, point out to people, though, that, like you said, we wanted to point out these issues. So the stuff is not like in vain. It's not like just like some theoretical history that, you know, we can intellectually masturbate on. I feel like it's important that we look at these lessons not only because of the criteria in which we selected the successors of Malcolm, but also because of the points that we focused on are relevant today. And because they're relevant today, it's like something that I feel like we need to analyze in the context of, okay, how can we apply this? Would this work? Would this would not work? You know, why and why not? You know, rather than, you know, it's important that we know this because it gives us some sort of like pride in like they came from my religion or they came from my race or ethnicity or tribe or whatever. It's from, okay, they put in the work. These are the lessons they learned. This is how I can apply them to this struggle that we're continuing. you know, not just some like theoretical fantasy of like, well, did you know that I found out in this book? Okay, but you ain't so much as passed out a pamphlet in the hood. So I don't care about how many books you read or why you feel your position is the strongest. Your analysis devoid of practice makes your theory irrelevant. So the theories and practice that we analyze with these successors is extremely relevant today. Not only to us as Muslims, but to people in struggle, period. People struggling against the American empire. This is very relevant things that we can lessons we can practically apply. So please look at this series and whatever you see us do through that vein.
Yeah, and it's like, you know, there was a number of conversations, events, other webinars before we did this
that had those information.
There was engagements, right? And there was these different debates and discussions, right? And it can be easy if you're talking about stuff that people haven't been exposed to. It can be easy for that debate or discussion to degenerate into personality versus personality. If everyone's not on the same footing. Instead of us going and arguing against people with facts that everyone might not have all these details, we said, look, you know, let's present the basis of these points. You know what I mean? Let's present, instead of just saying, well, we don't like that, let's present for people how our elders learned these lessons. How did our elders in the Black Power movement learn these lessons? How did our elders in these different organizations learn these lessons? And maybe by us presenting that, it can advance the conversation forward in terms of what's the most effective use of our time and energy. As we're organizing and doing things, what's the most effective use? Right, when we're discouraging people from getting wrapped up in the Bernie Sanders craze, some people think we're just being polemical, we're just being these rhetorical arguments for the sake of argument, for the sake of whatever content, and wallahi, in all actuality, we were trying to save people the time, energy, effort, headache and heartache from really being inspired, hopeful, and invested in this clear sham trickery that Bernie Sanders was doing, right? And you know, so when we come with these things, it could be easy to see it as, well, you know, they're pontificating on their perspective and what they think is important and what are their talking points. But the reality of the situation is we're people of struggle. We're people of struggle, and we don't want to go in circles. We want to go forward, and we want people to be efficient. We want to cooperate and be a part of bigger, broader movement, but we also don't want to just be swept up in ignorance. And we definitely, you know, we definitely don't want to be following behind stuff that's obviously futile, right? So that's why we learn from history. No two Muslims should get stung from the same hole. If he gets bit by a snake in that hole, when I get close to that hole, I should be already preparing to deal with a snake, not putting my foot right in front of the snake to get bit too. And so that's the spirit of it. It's like, you know, let's deal with the lessons that we can grow from.
And just to add, like when we were discussing the series and the idea, one of the things that we wanted to think about was also the stage of history that we're in. Like we do have good speakers already in actually the Muslim community that discusses, is not part of that 80%, you know, we do have good speakers, but we wanted to focus on right now, the struggle after Minnesota, I know, and right now stuff happening in Portland with the protesters who defended themselves from, and who, in order to defend himself out of self-defense, he shot this right-wing protester. And then later on, when the police wanted to arrest this person, mysteriously they killed him. So what we're seeing is the administration being very, very serious about targeting specific kinds of actors and actions. And we just now saw these kinds of information that are coming from various cities in the US where there's direct confrontations happening. Some people are talking about civil war type of mentality, polarization in society. Now, no speech is not going to save that at that point. So we're looking at figures who've done works that cannot be easily reduced to speeches. Malcolm himself cannot be done that. We know a little bit about his life, and we tried to share 1964, which was also the election year at that time between Goldwater and Johnson, which was a similar situation. And there was, civil rights bill came after. So it's important to understand the kinds of debates that were happening at the time and Malcolm's positions and the results of after his successors and what they've done. So I think it's very relevant for us. We don't just think that the specific individuals we covered are historically important. We think they're relevant in today's moment. Of course, we have to read other things about today's world and we have to update certain ideas and so on. But it was very informative in that sense for us. So we want to go behind the speeches and everything. We're not just talking about forms of speech that gives cultural pride or something like that. We want to go beyond sort of the identity questions and more into analysis and how to actually participate in society against the machine in a way that is effective and not just immediately shut down because of some talks or things like that. So inshallah, I think that's all I could add on that point. And
we want to see people being effective.
Yeah.
And at the grassroots level, right?
Right.
You don't have to be some big leader to be effective. You don't have to be some big individual, some famous individual to have a big impact. But the more you can learn from history and the more that we can embody the lessons learned by our predecessors, the more impact we can have, inshallah.
Inshallah.
We want to see people become very effective revolutionaries. Mm-hmm. We want to see everyone become effective. If we're missing something, it's one of two things. Either we needed the help that perhaps you could provide, or it's something that you're actually more suited to provide. Mm-hmm. And so we want to see people have that do for self attitude as well. You know what I mean? And we want to embody that as well. Because like, we're not media people. I'm not a media person. I'm like technologically ignorant. We're not technological people. But something was missing from the webinars that we were seeing. Something was missing from the public conversation. So we're like, we have to find a way to present that. We have to find a way to bring that forward. And the same thing needs to happen if we're missing something, right? Because nobody can do everything. Nobody can play all the roles. If there's something you're acutely aware of, perhaps that's Allah giving you purpose. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Perhaps that's Allah providing for you a means of good deeds, a means of purifying yourself through that struggle. And it's not all for us. Like, we need to grow and we need to learn and we need to take criticism and advice and tips and everything. But, one thing we saw is that there was something lacking and we didn't want to blame people for lacking that thing. So we thought, what's the most productive way we can bring it to the conversation? Instead of saying, oh, you guys aren't talking about this. You guys didn't know that. You guys didn't know this. How are you talking about this? And you don't know nothing about that. So we said, let's present it in a way that's positive and inclusive that people can deal with it and not feel attacked, not feel like something's being targeted at them, and just feel like you can engage with it and deal with it. And it's not a hostile, combative type of thing when we present it. And that's why we came up with this series.
I want to add one little thing, which is when we were discussing shirk and belief and non-belief, I want to just let people know that those listeners and viewers who are not Muslim, that we have an understanding also of non-Muslims as different categories of non-Muslims who work with Muslims. There's a long history of tradition of that. Malcolm himself is part of that tradition. So he worked with a lot of people who were not Muslim. So I just want to make sure that there was no confusion about that. But we were talking about an Islamist politics, and it does engage with particular types of non-Muslims as well. So, so I'd like for you to encourage you to read up on that and ask questions about that if there's questions on that, inshallah. We don't want you to think we're hostile about interaction.
Yeah. And also, I really appreciate all of the comments and feedback that we get. We may not always understand the question or the comment. We may not be providing a good answer. But I hope that everyone who's attending will know that we appreciate all your thoughts. We appreciate the questions, concerns, criticisms, and you know, what we're doing with this series is already fixed, but we're definitely open to a lot of possibilities for future subjects that we want to cover. Inshallah.
All right, so that's it for today. Right? Inshallah, we'll be back next Saturday. Our time is going to continue to be 11.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. So the next few things, we will update you with emails and everything else. We'll start again at the same time, 11 a.m. Pacific time, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.